In the 1980s, Dungeons and Dragons was accused of being a gateway to Satanism as well as to a variety of immoral and dangerous activities. Join me as we delve into the dark days of the Satanic Panic and explore how it shaped the future of D&D. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. Today we're going to be talking about this movement, or really conspiracy theory, and I'll talk about that later in the video, of the Satanic Panic, or ritual satanic abuse, whatever you want to call it, that was kind of sweeping through the nation of the United States, at least, but it did have global implications as well. In much of the 1980s, it kind of died out in the early 1990s, but it had a huge impact on the way that TSR was going to market the game of Dungeons and Dragons, and as well as influencing the direction of the game, the mechanics of the game, and the flavor and the aesthetics that were going to occur in the second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason for this is because the Satanic Panic swept up Dungeons and Dragons along with a variety of other so-called, influential and dangerous forms of, it could be media or social institutions and things like that, that people began blaming for things that were happening to their kids, to the youth of the day. And so we're going to be talking about that, and I'm going to break it up into sort of a few different key areas. I'm going to be talking about some famous cases, police cases of disappearances of kids, one in particular that kind of kickstarted this whole thing off. And then going into two very specific incidents that happened, the creation of an organization that was anti-Dungeons and Dragons, the publication of some comic forms of telling the dangers of playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons that were distributed freely, mostly by churches. And then lastly, sort of a famous interview that happened on 60 Minutes. All this stuff is kind of culminating together. And then we'll get into like how that impacted TSR in terms of their decisions going forward with the game of Dungeons and Dragons. So those are kind of going to be the key areas that I talk about. Along the way, I also am going to discuss, when we talk about the Satanic Panic, I'm going to discuss how it is that people sort of get swept up into believing in conspiracy theories and why that happened, because that's what it was. And so again, we'll talk about that later in the video. Now, I do want to point out, as you can probably guess from the topic, that this is going to be some sensitive type of material that we're talking about. And very specifically, one of the topics that's going to come up in this is that of suicide. And so I wanted to warn people ahead of time in case that's a topic that is distressing to you. And I totally understand if this is something that's not for you. But I did want to warn people ahead of time so they're not caught off guard when that comes up. Okay, so it's really difficult to pinpoint when exactly this started. However, for the specifics of Dungeons and Dragons, the game, the way that this all kind of comes together originally, where it starts, I would say, is the disappearance of a young student at Michigan State University named James Dallas Egbert III. Now, James was one of these very bright kids who'd kind of been promoted through school early. So he was a student at the university at the age of 16. I'm not sure if that's exactly when he started, but he's going to be 16 at the university when he ends up disappearing. This is in 1979. And nobody knew where he was. And again, you have to remember the time period. There was not this vast communication networks that we have now with cell phones and social media and that kind of thing to keep track of people. And so he kind of just, to use a modern term, falls off the grid. So he disappears and nobody knows where he is. The police can't find him. They're investigating. So James's mother hires a private investigator by the name of William Deere. And he starts looking into this. And one of the things that he discovers in his investigation is that James was a player of a relatively new game called Dungeons and Dragons. So again, this is 1979. The game's only been out for about 5 years at this point. So he looks into this a little bit further, and you have to remember that this is a time period where people don't know what this game is. No one's really heard of it aside from the small niche audience of people that are playing it. But the vast majority of the country has never heard of this game. It's a small independent publisher. It's not owned by Hasbro at the time. It was published by TSR Inc., originally called Tactical Studies Rules, and then had to change names. But so William Deere looks into this, and he decides to make a connection to this idea that James was playing a live action version of Dungeons and Dragons in the steam tunnels underneath the university, which is something that he heard about from other people there, that people were playing live action versions in these steam tunnels. So he seizes on that as the culprit, as this idea that, like, most likely he was playing a live action version and got lost in these steam tunnels while he was down there playing, and got lost in a sense of, like, physically, like he got lost, but also there was this sort of overarching theory that he got lost in his character. He got lost in the game and wasn't able to separate fantasy from reality. Well, as it turns out, James had a lot of clinical depression issues that were caused by a variety of reasons. I'm not going to really get into those reasons right now. Suffice to say, he was predisposed, unfortunately, due to his depression, to try to inflict self-harm. And he did try to kill himself in the steam tunnels underneath the school, but he failed. And so after that, he actually runs. He's on the run. He flees, and he ends up in St. Louis for a while, and then ultimately is going to end up in New Orleans. Now, from what I've understood, when this happened, he wasn't aware of this, like, essentially almost like a statewide or almost countrywide manhunt looking for him, trying to find out what had happened to him, because nobody knew. He wasn't communicating with anybody, especially like not his mother and things like that. So she's, trying to figure out what happened to him. And so he's missing for months. And so during this time, in order to try to get attention to this case and try to get people to be aware that people are looking for him and to, get tips in, the way that this information was spread was this use of this sensationalist tactic that Dungeons and Dragons caused this kid to get lost, and it's the fault of this game for making him become lost. And so whatever information you have, like, let us know. And people start spreading misinformation, like, of course you can imagine. And so people are saying, oh, they saw him at Gen Con, but no, that wasn't the case. And that due to the timing wise, that couldn't have been the case as to when Gen Con was held versus when he was missing. So all these different things happen. Well, he is going to end up realizing that people are looking for him. And so they find him, and he goes home. And but unfortunately, a year later, he does successfully commit suicide. It was very, very unfortunate, and so young to have that happen. And I know his family had to be, beyond them, beside themselves. Just watching a kid die is a horrible thing. So, as far as that relates to Dungeons and Dragons, however, it was out there. This idea that somehow this game was responsible for James committing suicide spread pretty quickly. Now, in 1984, William Deere is going to publish a book talking about the case. And in that book, he actually states that he was wrong, and that he realized that Dungeons and Dragons really had nothing to do with James committing suicide, and it was due to other issues in James's life. And again, I'm going to not talk about those out of respect for the dead. So you can look them up easily online, but it doesn't. The point is, William Deere says that Dungeons and Dragons was not responsible. However, the number of people who saw this on the news or read it in the newspaper that Dungeons and Dragons was responsible far outweighs the number of people that read this book by William Deere, where he retracted this theory. So it's out there, and you're not gonna cover it up at this point. And so that really, to me, is the start, because then after that, after the James Dallas Egbert case, you start to see so many people coming forward talking about how their kids committed suicide, and police and parents and school teachers and clergy, all these people making this connection, like, oh, and these kids also played Dungeons and Dragons, so of course that's what's responsible. So there's a variety of those cases that are going to come up. However, this part of the reason for that is that this is taking place within the framework of the Satanic Panic. So then we kind of have to talk about, well, what was the Satanic Panic? Where did it come from? And why were people so swept up in it? So the Satanic Panic, it's really difficult to pinpoint down exactly when this started. It predates, really, I mean, it goes back to, hundreds of years. So I'm going to just be focusing on the movement in the United States starting around 1980-ish. It start, again, these dates are fluid. There's no like exact moment in time. However, when you have the James Dallas Egbert case of his disappearance happening in 1979 and then ultimately his suicide in 1980, all that timing is lining up. So a lot of people will point to a specific book, and it's called Michelle Remembers. Now, this book was published in the 1980s. I think it was 1980 specifically, and it was written by a Canadian psychologist named Lawrence Pasden or Pasder. And Lawrence was talking about a patient named Michelle Smith. Now, interestingly enough, that patient is going to, in the future, become his wife. But in the book, he talks about doing something called recovered memory therapy. And that is now widely discredited practice. But at the time of doing this, what he was doing with this memory recovery therapy basically directed Michelle to start coming up with stories or so-called memories of some satanic ritual or abuse, or sometimes called SRA, that she suffered when she was a young child. And she talked about human sacrifice and, again, the abuse. And there were just a variety of like really horrific things that she talks about involving children and pornography and that kind of thing. So that book kind of started to capture the attention of the public, and people started really looking into this. It's like, is this really happening? Like, this is, something's out there, this sinister group of people that are directing and controlling and doing things that we weren't aware of. And thank goodness that this psychologist discovered this so that we can investigate it further. Well, it gets to the point where there are government agencies that are funneling money into groups that are investigating this so-called widespread satanic ritual abuse, movement, if you want to call it that. So eventually the Satanic Panic is going to involve things like, ultimately it intersects with dissociative identity disorder and also anti-government conspiracy theories. All of this is going to kind of all work together with these people who are proposing this idea that there is a sinister group of clandestine Satanists that are conducting these horrific experiments behind our backs, and we have to be vigilant to know what they're doing so that we can bring them out into the light of day. That's really what this was about. And people really believed it. Certain people believed it. We'll just put it that way. But you might be familiar with the McMartin preschool trial. If you were a kid of the 80s like me, I was born in 1970, but you definitely heard about this. So this was the most expensive and longest criminal trial in the United States history. The allegations were first made in 1983 that some kids were being, abused at this preschool. And the trial is going to last. Well, they're going to do a police investigation from 84 to 1987. And then the trial is going to go from 1987 to 1990, at which point all of the allegations and the accusations were dropped. Nothing, there were no criminal, charges. None of that happened. Everything was proved to have been false. Now, this all starts with this mother who, as it turns out, had she suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and chronic alcoholism. And she's the one that made a suggestion or an allegation that her child had been abused by this preschool. And it gets to the point where the government agencies involved, they start sending letters to all of the parents of kids who had, either currently enrolled or had previously been enrolled as preschool, saying, hey, it's come to light that there might have been some sexual misconduct happening at this school and some abuse. So talk to your kids and then let us know. And that's how this thing took off. And it was discovered that a lot of the adults that were trying to talk to these kids were planting false memories with them and leading them. The discussion was leading to where the only answer they could give would be one that confirmed that this abuse was taking place. Now, interestingly, as of 1994, there were 12,000 documented accusations of some type of satanic ritual abuse, and not a single one was found to be true. There was no substantiation for any of them. That's how widespread this was. 10 or 12,000 accusations, and not a single one was true. So, but again, this is the framework of the mindset of people when this D&D stuff is going on, because people are looking for like any sort of connection. Now, it turns out that a lot of people will point to actually predating that book, Michelle Remembers, there were just movies, fictional movies. So there's Rosemary's Baby in 1968. There's The Exorcist and The Omen in the early 70s. And it turns out that a lot of these so-called satanic ritual abuse allegations, people were recalling scenes from those movies as though it actually happened to them. Again, because of the very disputed type of psychological techniques that were being used to interview these people. So they were basically creating these false memories, and whether they did that on purpose or not, who can say, but that was the end result. So you also have a book written in 1972 by Mike Warnke, I believe his name is, and it was a, quote unquote memoir called The Satan Seller. And in it, he alleges that he was the leader, a Satanist leader of a group of 1,500 people that performed human sacrifice and all kinds of like terrible, terrible things. And this was a best-selling book in 1972. Well, 2 decades later, it was completely debunked as being false, but he alleged that like he was saved by some evangelical Christian church, and that's what made him write this book. But it was completely made up. None of that ever happened. But again, most people don't hear the retractions. They hear the thing that is the sensations thing. It's titillating to them to hear that this might actually exist. Okay. So then you had a psychiatrist, Roland Summit, and basically, the way that he frames his argument is that anybody who doesn't believe, he was talking about the McMartin preschool case I talked about earlier. He says anybody who didn't believe that those accusations were true, he says, well, they're part of this conspiracy to cover it up. So there's no room in his mind that these allegations can't be true, because to him they're true. So if you don't believe it, it means that you're trying to cover it up. You're part of some kind of elaborate conspiracy. And that conspiracy gets blown way out of proportion, where people are talking about that there's a satanic conspiracy permeating throughout all American communities, and we need to be vigilant to keep on guard. So this is, again, why people were so eager, or I guess maybe eager is not the right word, but they were so readily available to believe that somehow Dungeons and Dragons was satanic and it was causing students or kids, children, to commit these horrible acts, whether it was self-harm or whether they're harming others. And they include a list of things that we wouldn't normally think of as being bad, but things like, drug use is bad, but even things like your sexual identity. And they're saying, well, that's a perversion and that's caused by Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so they say that the way that it stayed hidden all this time, this is the conspiracy theory part, the way it stays hidden is because the others always have infiltrated the media and law enforcement, and they're using morticians and crematoriums like the officials there to cover up these murders. And it's unbelievable that people that's how far they're going to explain why nobody knows that this exists. And in their minds, it's like, well, it has to be a cover up by the mortician, not reporting directly what really happened. They're covering up these murders. And then there were people talking about this idea that people had these alternate personalities that could be activated with a code word, and they could become assassins or sex workers or any kind of thing like that by, because this personality had been hidden deep and down, but it could be unlocked with this like code word. And the way that the conspiracy theory there works is that, well, the absence of these people having memories that this happened to them, or the absence of any evidence at all, well, that's proof. That is evidence to show how far the other side's willing to go to cover this up. These people have no memory that this happened to them. So of course it's a conspiracy. It's like a catch-22. And that's how they're able to, the people that believe this, they're able to reconcile the lack of evidence. And they reconcile that by saying, well, there is no evidence, which is evidence. Makes no sense to me, but a lot of people believe that. So the panic really dies off around 1992, 1995, something like that, in that neighborhood. But as you can hear from this, many of these tropes, many of these ideas of explaining how these conspiracy theories exist are still used by groups today. I'm sure you all know some that I'm talking about here. I'm not going to name names, but to understand how people get caught up in something like this, because I think there's this idea, this mindset that like people that believe conspiracy theories are simple-minded or they're not mentally well, things like that. And that's not really true. So there was a study by Emory University, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but the way they explain it is that people that believe in conspiracy theories are looking for a way to make sense of some distress or some impairment that is occurring to them. And that what they're really looking for is they want to feel safe in their environment, but then they also want to identify, they want to feel that the community that they identify with is superior to other communities. That's part of this belief in conspiracy theories, is that you know something that other people don't, and that gives you a sense of superiority. So I thought I would talk about an interesting comic book, actually, that I read, or that I collect, and it's called The Department of Truth. So this is issue number 23. My first issues are kind of packed away, but this is by Image Comics, and this deals with the idea. The whole thing of this is this idea of conspiracy theories, and the premise is that there's a government agency called the Department of Truth that actually promotes and controls conspiracy theories that are out there. And there's a fantastic element to this too, because the idea is that if enough people believe in a thing, that thing will actually become true. And so it deals with like fake moon landings, the JFK assassination. It deals with flat earth theory, like the Denver airport. There's a conspiracy theory there. The Mothman, Bigfoot. There's a conspiracy theory that the Catholic Church has erased like 300 years or falsely created 300 years of history. Around the time of Charlemagne, in the Holy Roman Empire, that there's like a different timeline, and that we're actually roughly 300 years off of the timeline that we're in right now. I'd never heard that one before, but I read about it here, and then I looked it up, and it's a legitimate conspiracy theory that people believe in. But this comic book actually really helped me wrap my head around how people begin to believe in these types of conspiracy theories. And one of the things that I saw and that this helped me understand was for flat earthers, and the idea of there was a video where this guy has like a plate with a lemon on it, or just holding a lemon. And he says, how can the earth be round? Because you pour water. And so he pours water on the lemon and the water runs off, of course, right? And then he says, well, that makes no sense. But if you have a plate, like a dish, and then you pour the water on, the water stays on there. It doesn't drip off. And so he's like, that's how you explain the earth is flat, because you pour the water on and the water stays on it. If the earth were round, the water would just fall off the sides. So of course that makes no sense, but to somebody who doesn't really grasp and understand how gravity works and all this kind of stuff, that is a way for them to simply say, oh, I see. So that makes sense. And so then they start believing that like, now I know something. This guy showed me something, and now I can wrap my head around how this works, because I never really understood how the earth can be round, because I can't see it. I can't see the curvature. It looks flat to me. And so this makes more sense that it is round. And for whatever reason, somebody's promoting this idea that the earth is round. Now, why they would be promoting that, I have no idea if it weren't really true. But the idea is that this person then thinks that they're part of this special group who knows a piece of information that nobody else knows, and it makes them feel superior. And then because of that, then, and especially now, the way social media works is if you watch that video and then like it and comment on it, the almighty algorithm is going to say, oh, they like that. I'm going to show them another conspiracy theory video. Now, the algorithm's not doing it maliciously. It's just looking for clicks and ad revenue, right? But you're going to get served more things in the realm of people who believe, if you believe that, you'll probably also believe this, and that you go down this rabbit hole. And that's kind of how this happened with the Satanic Panic. So that's going to bring us to 1984 and a man by the name of Jack Chick. So this was actually the reason that I ended up making this video. So one of my viewers in the last video that I did last week on demonic possession and things like that is a Halloween themed episode for the channel. And this viewer, Matthew Ludivico, I think, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. He asked if I could do a video about the Jack Chick Dark Dungeons. And I thought, that's a really fun idea for a video, but I wanted to expand it a little bit to go beyond that and put it in the context of like why this was created. So if you're not familiar with this, Jack Chick was an American cartoonist, and he published his own sort of little morality plays that he told through sequential art in a sequential art format. And they were called tracts. So people talk about this all the time. They'll say, oh, Jack Chick published a tract, but nobody ever explains what a tract is, TRACT. And maybe it's just assumed, but they're literary works that are usually religious. And in current parlance, typically a tract is considered to be sort of like a pamphlet, and it's mostly religious, could be for political purposes, and they're just sort of left around for people to find. Or they are handed out by people. So I've seen them on my morning walks here in Pasadena, not Jack Chick tracts specifically, but other ones. They're usually extremely offensive, the ones I've seen. And they're just lying. Like people will just put them like on each driveway. And I see them as I'm walking along in the morning. It's very interesting. But they're about 3 inches by 5 inches, roughly, give or take. And they're usually about 20 pages long. And Jack Chick's tracts are just, he's not a preacher, or he wasn't, or anything like that. He just had some very strongly held beliefs that are mostly anti-Catholic, they're homophobic, they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-Islam, they are anti-Masonic, like Freemason, anti a lot of things. And his publishing group has been accused of being a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So that gives you some context as to what was going on here. But in 1984, he published, for our purposes, probably his most famous tract, which was called Dark Dungeons. And the idea was that it was based on a faux kind of D&D game. They don't call it D&D in here. Well, actually, I think they used the initials D&D, but because the comic was called Dark Dungeons, the idea was that, oh, that's the game they're playing. It's called Dark Dungeons because, of course, he doesn't want to get sued for copyright and trademark by using the name Dungeons and Dragons. But using the shortened version D&D, it's pretty clear it's what they're talking about. Also, there is a dungeon master, which I believe now is a trademark term. It might not have been in 1984, but the gist of this comic strip is that there are these kids playing Dark Dungeons, and this character named Marcy, her thief dies. Blackleaf, the thief, doesn't find a poison trap. And the dungeon master says, I declare her dead. And then Marcy says, no, not Blackleaf. No, I'm going to die. And then she says, don't make me quit the game. Please don't. Somebody save me. You can't do this. So this is what people really thought. There was this idea, for whatever reason, that was purported by a lot of these anti-Dungeons and Dragons folks, that players of the game were not able to separate their character from themselves, and that if their character died in the game, that would give them suicidal thoughts. That's where all these suicide sort of connections, supposed connections, come from. This idea that these kids were not smart enough, or that they're living in this fantasy world where they can't separate fantasy from reality. So this character, Marcy, is very distraught, and they make her leave the game as opposed to how you would normally play, which is roll up a new character. It's fine. Or nowadays, of course, in 5e, you would have like, 3 death saves or something. So the chance of dying, of your character dying, is almost nil. But at the time when this was done, all you would do is just get out some dice and roll a new character, or you might even have one ready to go already. I usually have in my daughter's game, each of the players has made a backup character to have ready to go if their character dies. So then later on in the comic strip, Debbie, who is another player in the game, is approached by the dungeon master, and it says, the dungeon master says, "Debbie, your cleric has been raised to the 8th level. I think it's time that you learn how to cast, or how to really cast spells." And then she says, "You're going to teach me the real power?" And the dungeon master says, "Yes." So Debbie shows up and she says, "I've brought Elfstar to become a priestess and witch." And then it says, the little caption says, "The intense occult training through D&D prepared Debbie to accept the invitation to enter a witch's coven." And then it says, they say, "Welcome, Elfstar. Now you will become a priestess of the craft and the temple of Diana." So there's a pentagram here and all these robed figures. It's very much like in an occult style situation here. And so then later on, Debbie comes back to the dungeon master and says like, "Oh, I've learned the real power and I cast a real spell." And the dungeon master says, "What did you cast?" And she said, "I cast a spell on my father, like to bond his mind. It's a mind bondage spell. And he was trying to stop me from playing D&D, but instead he ends up buying me over $200 worth of D&D manuals and figures." And the dungeon master's like, "I'm super impressed. Like that's you've done it. Like you have the personality for this." So then later on in the comic strip, it says that Marcy is calling to talk to Debbie because she's really upset. And Debbie's like, "I can't be bothered right now. I am fighting the zombie." So apparently, zombie, capital Z. So in this game, I guess there's only one zombie and she's fighting it. And so she finishes her game and then later on, like casually goes over to Marcy's house, like, "Hey, what's up?" And the mom's like, "Oh, Marcy's locked in a room. She won't come out. I'm glad you're here." And Debbie goes into the room and Marcy has committed suicide and left a note saying, "It's my fault. Blackleaf died. I can't face life alone." And so then Debbie feels upset and the dungeon master's chastising her, like, "Marcy was a loser. Like you need to let Elfstar take over." Like, and Debbie's like, "I don't want to be Elfstar anymore. I want to be Debbie." And then basically at the end of the comic, Debbie gets found by a friend who invites her to church, and the church saves her, and they burn all of her D&D books, and everything's great now. And Debbie's on the path of the right and narrow and straight and narrow and all that kind of stuff because, she was saved from the evil of Dungeons and Dragons, or that, quote, that lousy D&D manual. Now, this one that you're looking at here that I'm showing on the screen, this is actually from Jack Chick's website, which personally I kind of hated to visit, but I wanted to show the comic strip as it is now. I don't own it in physical form. It's been out of print, I think, for a while, so they actually do command quite a bit. They'll print them for you if you want, as my understanding is. Jack Chick Publications. Jack Chick died 8 years ago, but his company is still around, and they will print this for you if you want to order them. But you have to order; it's like a minimum order, and my understanding is it's it's close to $1,000 or something to get all of the copies. So it has changed over the years. I looked at a website called The Escapist that helped talk about this, and they show the different versions of this. The main change in this comic strip that is out now on the website versus the one that was published back in 1984 is that originally the comic strip mentioned that not only is so-called Dark Dungeons, aka D&D, not only is it bad, but also it warns that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien's works are also part of the occult. And that was removed. And the theory is that it was removed because the estates of those two, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, were going to come after him. And so he removed those references in here to avoid that. So I'm not sure if that's the case or not, but it's like minor changes, like here and there. Sometimes clothing changes, like they update the clothing, I guess, to make it more contemporary or something. I'm not really sure. But and anyway, that's Dark Dungeons. So this was out there. This was printed where I guess a lot of people wouldn't see it. I personally have never seen a single chick tracked out in the wild. So I don't know exactly where these things would be distributed or left around for people to find or handed out or whatever. But I would love to hear from you folks if you have seen these. Leave a note down in the comments and let me know, like if this is something that happened when you were young and you saw this come out, and if it affected you or if it made you want to learn more about D&D or whatever it was. So I'd love to hear stories from folks that have seen this before. Again, sort of in the wild, not looking at it now like I am, but at the time, like actually just kind of stumbling across it or being handed it or something like that. So that's the Dark Dungeons. Now we're going to talk about a couple more things, specifically a group that was created again, I think roughly around the same time period, 1984-ish. And it's called B.A.D., B-A-D-D, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. So the short version of this is that this young child died, unfortunately, by committing suicide, shot himself with a handgun. So the theme here is that all these suicides, for the most part, all involve guns. It's not other types of suicide. But his name was Irving Lee, and he was playing in a D&D group at a school run by the principal, from what I understand. And in the game, his character had been cursed. And then the boy, through a series of other reasons, ended up committing suicide. And his mother Pat, then found out afterward that he was playing D&D. And so she blamed his suicide on the principal, whom she tried to sue. And then also she tried to sue TSR for making this game that caused her son to commit suicide. So it's horrific. I can't even imagine the tragedy and the kind of mindset that you're in. So I don't want people coming in the comments and making fun of Pat Pulling. That's not the point of this. Like, she lost her son. She's also passed away now. She died of cancer back in 1997. But, she suffered a horrific loss and was trying to make sense of it. And as a lot of people do, they look outside for blame. They want to blame someone else for how this could have happened. However, he didn't commit suicide because of D&D. That's been proven. There were plenty of other factors involved. But it was to the point she was so upset that she created this group that has effectively ceased to exist after she passed away. But it got a lot of national attention. She proposed herself and marketed herself as being an expert on these types of games. And she was, like, Congress talked to her, police agencies would talk to her whenever there was some kind of like suicide involved with kids that played Dungeons and Dragons. She was consulted due to her expertise in this kind of thing. And it's, again, all been debunked now. It was debunked as early as 1990. Michael Stackpole, who was a very prolific and famous author. We've talked briefly about him before, mostly known for his Star Wars books, also some Battletech books. But he wrote a book called The Polling Report in 1990 that basically disproves every one of the claims that she made about how Dungeons and Dragons specifically, but also role-playing games in general, are responsible for teen suicide rates and delinquency and other types of, immoral activities being committed by children. Now, 1984 is also when a book based on a fictional book based on the James Dallas Egbert case is going to debut. I believe it's 1984, and that's called Mazes and Monsters. So actually, the book is published in 1981, and then it becomes a 1982 made-for-TV movie, Mazes and Monsters. Most people in the D&D community are familiar with this. It's one of the first appearances of Tom Hanks on TV, and he's the star before he was a star. This is like before Booze and Buddies and all that kind of thing. So, but it's a fictional account of the thing that happened. And then there's going to be, of course, because that became somewhat popular, people are going to try to copy that format. So there's several other books or films or TV movies or whatever that come out that have a very similar theme to this, of kids playing a fantasy game, but it's not really fantasy, it's real, and they didn't know it was real and whatever. Okay, so that's kind of going on, but all of this is really, I think, going to come to a head in a 60 Minutes special that aired in 1985. So if I should have looked at before, but I think 60 Minutes might still be on CBS. When I was a kid, it was on Sunday nights, I think at 7. And I never watched it because that was opposite of The Muppet Show, I think. And I would much rather watch The Muppet Show. So I was aware that 60 Minutes was around, but I actually didn't even see this when it first debuted. That's how out of touch I was with current news and 60 Minutes specifically. Like, I was aware the show was on, but I definitely would have watched this episode had I known. But Gary Gygax is going to be on 60 Minutes. And now the host of this episode of 60 Minutes was Ed Bradley. And he basically repeats a claim without any kind of justification or any kind of journalistic, I want to say journalistic integrity. He made a mistake, but it was a pretty huge mistake. But he says that it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders. And he cites these fictitious cases that, again, have all been debunked. And so Gary Gygax is brought onto the show, and opposite of him is going to be Pat Pulling and her B.A.D.D group, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, and also this guy by the name of Thomas Radecki, who at the time was the president of the National Coalition on TV Violence. So my understanding of this is that Gary Gygax was sort of caught unawares as exactly how hostile this interview was going to be, and that it wasn't going to be really sort of like a discussion and talking to him about what the game is, but rather it was very accusatory and putting him on the spot, asking, doesn't he feel any sense of responsibility for harming these young kids because of the game? And I'm going to show some clips from the show so you can kind of see a little bit of this.
The company that makes the Dungeons and Dragons material is TSR Incorporated of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. They estimate there are 3 to 4 million kids who play the game. Last year, they grossed nearly $30 million, with Dungeons and Dragons books and paraphernalia accounting for most of those sales. Gary Gygax owns the company and invented the game. Dieter Sturm is the head of public relations. There are a number of cases that have been documented where there is some connection between D&D. I'm not saying that D&D is the cause of the death, but paraphernalia from the game has been found at the scene of the death. Notes, suicide notes referring to the game have been found. And all of these people, in a dozen or so cases, have been documented as avid D&D players. And you see no connection whatsoever?
We see no connection for the fact that right now there's some 3 to 4 million players of the game actively through. Suicide is an epidemic through with 5,000 kids a year now taking their lives. I think that to say that because that child played Dungeons & Dragons, who's to say that that child does not watch television, does not participate in high school sports or what per se?
I have yet to see one bit of valid clinical evidence to show that this has been anything more than coincidental with a disturbed child. If you found 12 kids in murder-suicide with one connecting factor in each of them, wouldn't you question it? That's all people do. I would certainly do it in a scientific manner, and this is as unscientific as you can get. It's nothing but a witch hunt.
Dr. Thomas Radecki is a psychiatrist who teaches at the University of Illinois Medical School and who is chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence. He has been studying the game for several years and says there are 28 deaths related to Dungeons and Dragons in the last 5 years.
And some of those was clearly the decisive element, and other ones it was just a major element in the thinking of the people at the time they committed suicide or murder. Is not coincidence. Not when you have careful documentation, you have careful notes, you have eyewitnesses. For instance, one case, the parents were actually saw their child summon the Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself. Another case, the kid thought he had the ability to astral travel coming from the Dungeons and Dragons game, that he could leave his body and come back. And he had rigged it up just according to the rule book, so he could do it. He was surrounded by his materials and put a bullet in his head so he could leave his body. He's never come back.
This is make-believe, and nobody's murdered, and there's no violence there. I mean, to use an analogy with another game, who was bankrupted by losing a game of Monopoly? reality is, because the money is make-believe, the property is make-believe, and the bankruptcy is make. I don't think anyone is suggesting that your intentions originally with this game were anything but good. It's a game to have some fun. But in the light of what some people would consider to be strong evidence, don't you really think that you have to rethink your position about the game and at least make known the potential for abuse of the game? I again have to go back and say there's no link that this is, except perhaps in the minds of those people who are looking desperately for any other cause than perhaps their own failure as a parent for their child's death. And further, anything can be abused. Now, are we going to try to go around and say this chair could be used by a violent person to strike another person? Therefore, it should have a warning label on it saying, "Caution: this can be used to assault you."
But they and then this guy Thomas Radecki, who was on, he claims that the game has been linked to 28 murders and suicide. So here's what's interesting about Thomas Radecki. He is a now former psychologist, and he's in jail. So he was convicted. He's a convicted criminal. And the reason he's in jail is because he used his doctor title and his role and his authority as a doctor to basically abuse women. And he also, or like his patients, right? And he also was prescribing falsely opioid prescriptions and using those prescriptions and trading them for sex. So not a great guy. And that was the person that they put up as sort of the expert on how D&D is terrible, was that guy. So, and once again, this is something that most people, and that didn't happen until years after. So at the time, maybe people weren't aware of this, but just the fact that was the guy that they brought forward, I think just discredits anything that could be said poorly about this. However, Gary's part of the interview, it doesn't really go well. Again, he was caught off guard, wasn't really prepared. And he gets a little, it comes across as defensive. He does say that people are looking for excuses rather than blaming their own parenting, which might be true, but doesn't sound very sensitive when you're talking about people whose kids have died. I think there was a better way to say that. Again, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but that was the gist of what he meant. So this 16-minute special is from 1985. It's pretty famous within the D&D community, the role-playing game community, because of that interview and how it really tried to portray that D&D was bad. So I believe, my understanding is that later on, Ed Bradley, again, is one of these things like way after the fact is going to say like, oh, I should have done more research. I'm not sure that he did that. I have a recollection of reading that he kind of tried to retract what he said during this show. But again, no one's going to see that. That the way that this kind of misinformation gets out there is just say whatever you want. And then later on go, oh, well, that's what I heard, or, whatever. And nobody hears the retraction, right? So it's part of the standard conspiracy theory playbook to do that. So that really is kind of how it comes to a head. But all of this is going to have an impact on the company of TSR and on the future direction of Dungeons and Dragons. And we're going to talk about that next. I would like to remind you that if this kind of history of tabletop role-playing games is interesting to you, please give a like to this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new content. I would really appreciate it. So the game of Dungeons and Dragons, and specifically even TSR and how they market the game, is going to change in the light of all this bad publicity that they're getting. Now, what's interesting is the bad publicity, and you've heard the old phrase, there's no bad publicity, right? So the James Dallas Egbert case actually ends up, partially at least, being responsible. I think there's other factors involved as well, but timing wise, that comes out, and the impact that it had as far as getting people to understand what D&D was, and that, it was this new game that was out there. People became more aware of it. Their sales, I want to say that's like they almost triple, or they more than triple. Like they go from like a revenue of like 2.3 million to 8.7 million, I think. I I think year over year. So, I mean, that was the impact that it had. It was crazy. They were saying how like the basic set, the Holmes basic set, the blue box was selling, I think around 5,000 copies a month when before that happened. And then after, it was selling 30,000 copies a month. Like that was the impact that this had. However, D&D did want to, or at least TSR, they didn't want to have these negative associations. So it was good for business, like, in a way, because it did give them a lot of publicity, but they wanted to be seen as a family friendly company. So one of the things that they're going to do to try to get that family friendly audience is they create a new mascot. So if you know the original mascots from D&D, there was the GK logo, and then there was the lizard man. I don't have the lizard man on any of these ones here, but then for a long time it's this guy. So this little wizard, well, they're going to kind of build off of this and create this character called Morley the wizard, and he was this family friendly type of character that could be used in marketing. And they're going to put him out for quite a while. For a number of years, they put him on the cover of a game called Fantasy Forest, which was sort of an introductory fantasy board game intended for younger children that kind of get them used to this idea of fantasy so that later when they got older, they could take up Dungeons and Dragons. So it impacts the marketing because TSR is aware that they want families on their side. They want people buying this game for their kids. And if people are scared, then they're not going to do that. So that's one of the things that they do. So, and you have to remember, again, when this game came out, so this is the monster manual. This is the kind of stuff that people are pointing to and saying, like, this game is bad. Like, you've got demons. It specifically says you have demons in the game. Succubi, and it just goes on and on. Okay, and then you have your devils, and who do you have here? As I always said, Asmodeus. I've heard some people say Asmodeus. I actually had never heard that before until just recently, but however you pronounce that. But all of these devils that have been named in different texts throughout history, as you know. And so putting them into this book, and again, some of the artwork was very titillating. We'll say, you know. So this is a kind of thing where it's hard for TSR to say, well, we're a family friendly game for kids when you've got that kind of artwork specifically in these books. Okay, so things are going to start changing. All right, now. One of the things that's going to happen is in the mid 80s, and we've talked about this before, Dungeons and Dragons, specifically Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, they've decided that they want to make a new version of the game. Now, originally that was going to be done by Gary Gygax. However, he leaves the company through a variety of reasons. I've talked about that before in other videos. I'll link to them up here. So he ends up leaving the company, not really by his own choice, but he does resign once he's kind of removed from all of his positions of power. He's left on the board, and that's not good enough for him, rightly so. So he resigns. And the direction of the game is taken up by Dave Cook, who's going to create the second edition of Advanced D&D. Now, we've talked all about this before, but in this famous article that he writes, which is called Who Dies, he talks about getting rid of some of the character classes and the concepts in the book. And he says the assassin is a goner, virtually guaranteed. It's highly unlikely that any amount of appeal will save his neck. So the assassin, as you're aware, if you've seen my video on the history of the assassin class, character class in Dungeons & Dragons, and it's going to get removed in second edition. So he talks about that in that article there, and then he revisits it here. And it's interesting because he does say, now this is coming out this is early. This is 1987. So second edition is not going to be released for another 2 years. But he says in this article here that he's not removing the assassin due to religious pressure. So that was kind of, says this is more a matter of mindset than a separate occupation. The unique abilities just don't work. In my opinion, the assassination table is a crock. The question of image that came up had nothing to do with any kind of religious pressure, as some of you mistakenly thought. Sorry, it's much more mundane. A lot of potential players have been turned off by bad experiences with uncontrolled assassins, destroying parties, campaigns, and fun for everyone else. No fun at all. So that's kind of his viewpoint. He's saying he got rid of assassins not to be family friendly, but because people just didn't like the class, and he just doesn't like it. He thinks it's pointless to have in a game. So, but he has to address that. He has to say, no, it's not because of the religious stuff, but that was there. I mean, it was, people were talking about it. Now, I have talked about this article as well, but this one is the much more kind of direct one. And this is by James Ward, The Game Wizards, Angry Mothers from Heck and What to Do About Them. So in this article, he basically talks about the idea of angry mother syndrome, and is something he says that if a topic will anger a normally calm, caring mother of a gamer, then we aren't interested in addressing that topic in any of our game products. I know that our company sells adventures full of swordsmen slashing away through armies with foul-smelling monsters waiting everywhere to crunch and eat player characters of every description, but I also know that there are clear differences between fighting for its own sake and fighting for a good cause. So he goes on to talk about that and basically just says we don't want to get letters from angry moms. He says, I had the designers and editors delete all mentions of demons and devils for the second edition rules. This is Dragon Magazine, number 154, by the way. And so he says, the game still has lots of tough monsters, but we now have a few more pleased moms as well. So he says, well, some people are going to use them anyway. And he says, great, go ahead. we're just not going to be in the official books. Okay, so it says, he talks about basically the guidelines that they're going to put in place to get it. Like they want their books to be, if it were a movie, G or PG at the most strong would be a PG. And so he says the level of violence, he talks about this. Now, I have gone over most of this article before, but I'm just kind of refreshing that for folks that haven't seen that video. But, that's the gist of this article. He's saying we're going to get rid of this. Well, they're going to get rid of a lot more than just demons and devils. They're going to change the artwork to get rid of all any nude stuff is gone. That's right out. Okay. And then they're also going to get rid of half-orcs. They don't really address that in any of these articles, but they get rid of half-orcs originally. Those are going to come back in the complete book of humanoids, but that's not really a core book. Now, what's interesting is people wrote in to complain, and James addresses their complaints. So this is part 2 of Angry Mothers, and this is issue number 158. And so he basically says he was deluged with letters, but then he said, well, it's really 91 plus. Which I assume just means 91. But he says maybe that's not a flood, but it was a lot. And so he said, when I have children there, so these are some of the letters he got. So one person writes in and says, when I have children, they are old enough, I'll start them on AD&D games. I hope it will be a rich experience for them, unfettered by the visions of someone else's mother. And that's the gist of these letters. People are saying like, I cannot help but feel that there's a degree of loyalty that should be shown to the players of the game who have stood by TSR rather than demon-bashing, evangelistic, closed-minded bores. So the gist of the complaints of the letters that they get are that you're kowtowing to a group of people that don't even play the game. So why would you do that? You should create the stuff for the people that are actually playing rather than bowing down to pressure from a small minority of people that aren't happy with it but weren't going to play anyway. And, that article does, or those points of view make sense. But he basically just says that's what it is. However, what they are going to do is come out with a supplement of extraplanar creatures that they're going to rename, but they're going to be evil and chaotic or whatever. And that will, he doesn't come right out and say it, but essentially what he's saying there, he's beating around the bush, but they're going to rename demons and devils and put them in their own book, the Monsters Compendium supplement for second edition, so that they don't, they don't have those names, demon devils, but effectively that's what they are. And then one of the things that they're going to do, so you'll see like there are no demons and devils in here. And, you see the artwork's much more fun. I love Tony D. Terlizzi art, by the way. But you can see it's a very different aesthetic from what you saw before. So what they're going to do with these demons and devils, they're going to rename them the Tanari and the Batazu, or however you want to say that. And what they do is create this sort of blood war between the two, so that the demons and devils are fighting on opposite. Well, they're not demons and devils, of course, but you get what I'm saying. You've got the chaotic evil, extraplanar creatures in a, generations long war called the Blood War with the lawful evil extraplanar creatures. And that war sort of ends up being the thing that defines them, rather than them trying to seduce mortals into carrying out their wishes. So that's a thing that's going to happen. Eventually in 1997, after Wizards of the Coast has purchased TSR, they are going to, one of the first things they do is immediately bring demons and devils back, starting with A Paladin in Hell. So there's a very famous picture here in the first edition Player's Handbook. We've looked at this before as well, but this is by Dave Sutherland III. This is A Paladin in Hell, and they're going to create a whole adventure based on this painting. And that is in 1987. That's going to bring demons and devils back to D&D after they've been gone for about a decade. Okay, they're also going to do things like rename deities and demigods. It's going to be renamed Legends and Lore. This is in the TSR days. Again, to kind of get away from this idea of gods being in the game, even though they're all still there. The interior contents are exactly the same. It's just going to rename it, like I said, Legends and Lore. And then in third edition, 2000, this is Wizards of the Coast again, you're going to see that demons and devils have come back into the game. So they've brought them back. So again, at this point, the sort of satanic panic is sort of over. And Wizards of the Coast is like, no, we're not going to bow down to pressure from people to remove something when those are people that aren't even going to play this game in the first place. So that is kind of the quick-ish history of the Satanic Panic and how it affected the game for a while, at least during the second edition. Very specifically, this is an edition that a lot of people think is kind of like sanitized, and some people say that in a bad way. Second edition has a lot of fans who really, really like it, but there were a lot of things that were removed out of the game to kind of try to placate that angry mother syndrome that James Ward talked about. So that's going to wrap up our look at the Satanic Panic, and specifically the Dark Dungeons comic tract by Jack Chick. And thanks again to Matthew for the suggestion. I hope everyone enjoyed this video. Please go into the comments below and let me know if you enjoyed it. And also, again, as a reminder, let me know your experiences with either the Satanic Panic or the Dark Dungeons thing. I didn't experience Satanic Panic when I was playing. I was alive during that time, but nobody around me was really invested in that. And interestingly enough, I was living in a pretty religious part of the country. I was living in Salt Lake City at the time. And I had friends who played, and I had friends who couldn't play and had to hide their books because their parents didn't let them play. But I wasn't like super close with them. But the majority of the people that I was friends with, and whether they were religious or not, there were no problems. So I didn't really experience that. And for me, and when I moved to California, I started to become friends with a group of people who played role-playing games, and I found out one of them, his mom was very much like a fundamentalist, like, you cannot play D&D, it's bad, it's evil, it's satanic, it's terrible. However, she was totally fine with him playing Role Master and Middle-earth role-playing. So for whatever reason, I guess she only associated Satanism with Dungeons and Dragons. But I would love to hear your experiences, so please drop them in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places in the show notes to join me on social media. You'll find a link to my blog. And you'll also find a way to support the channel, 2 different ways right now. One is you can become a super fan, and I would like to thank everyone who has done that so far. It makes such a huge difference to me, and I really, really appreciate your support in becoming a super fan. Just look for that little heart with the $ logo. You'll see it underneath the video description. Especially if you're on a laptop or a desktop, you'll see that, and you just click on that. And if you can donate whatever you can, I would really appreciate it. The other way is by buying something from my shop: t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, whatever, featuring exclusive design you can only get at the Daddy Roll the One shop. I do want to point out, if you are looking to buy something for folks for the holidays as a gift, I would recommend ordering sooner rather than later. I ordered a shirt for myself a little over almost a month ago, and I've yet to receive it. And I've talked to them, and they just said they're backlogged right now. So they're running a little bit slow. So I think if you want to order something now, you should be able to get it in time for the holidays, but I wouldn't wait too much longer. So definitely check that out in those links below. And that's going to be it for this video. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So drink-wise, this is whiskey old-fashioned cocktail, and I used rye whiskey. And in this particular case, what I did was, because it's it's fall time. Today is Monday, November 4th. So what I did over the weekend was I infused this whiskey with some cinnamon, some cloves, some star anise, and just put it in a jar with a like a mason jar. And I let it sit for about 24 hours, and then I strained it out. So I have this infused fall flavor whiskey, and then I made a simple old-fashioned with it. So I used 2 ounces of whiskey. I used about a teaspoon-ish of simple syrup. And I thought about making an infused simple syrup too, but I kind of felt like, what's the point? Because I've already infused the whiskey. I figured it would just get lost. So I just used a straight simple syrup, 1-to-1, sugar to water, a little bit of bitters. I used Angostura in this particular case. And then I spritzed an orange over the top because I wanted a little bit of like that fresh kind of orange oil flavor. So something simple. You can do this at home, super easy, but it's much fancier than just, drinking the whiskey neat. And again, it's going to bring those fall flavors in. So cheers. And there goes the fire truck again, of course, because that always happens when I'm recording. Okay, and then for the album I was listening to, so this actually was not what I planned to showcase today, but I heard yesterday late in the evening that legendary producer Quincy Jones had passed away. I think he was 91. So he had a long, full life. And I understand that he was surrounded by his family when he passed, which is nice that they were able to be there with him to say goodbye. But he just had a legendary career, like nearly 7 decades long he was a jazz trumpet player. He was an arranger, a conductor, composer, worked a lot of different films. The original Italian Job, but that was him, the original one from I think it's the 60s. But like They Call Me Mr. Tibbs and The Heat of the Night. If you've ever heard the theme song for Sanford and Son, that was him. And I know you've heard, if you've seen Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery, he wrote the song that they used. It's called Soul Bossa Nova, from an album, a big band bossa nova that came out, I don't know, 62 or something like that. But that song was used in that movie. So that kind of that's him. That's Quincy Jones wrote that. So just a legendary career, but also he produced this album. So this is Michael Jackson's Off the Wall 1980. It's going to be the first of 3 albums that Quincy Jones produced for Michael Jackson. And interestingly enough, as much as I like Quincy Jones, I was going through my vinyls, my vinyl catalog, to see what Quincy Jones stuff that I had, and he's worked on or produced or arranged a lot of stuff that I'm super familiar with: Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, Sarah Vaughan, Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, and I have records by all those people. I just don't have the ones that Quincy Jones produced. Unfortunately, I had someone on CD, but I'm doing a vinyl thing. So I had to go through my collection, and I'm kind of ashamed to say this is the only record of my collection, I'm pretty sure, that has any kind of connection to Quincy Jones, which is, again, he was the producer on this. So this is widely considered to be one of Michael Jackson's best albums, and usually critics say it's either between this or Thriller as to which one is his best. Now, B.A.D., which was the third album, Quincy Jones also produced Thriller and then produced B.A.D. That was the third of the 3. B.A.D. sold more, but most critics agree that this is a better record. So Quincy Jones worked with Michael Jackson to figure out exactly what songs were going to be on here. Michael wrote 3 of them, including the lead-off track, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. But there are other people on here. So Stevie Wonder co-wrote I Can't Help It, which is one of my favorite songs on this album. And so Quincy Jones was responsible for bringing these people in. Paul McCartney wrote Girlfriend. So Quincy Jones worked with Michael, but brought other people in to help write songs. But this is the first time, I think this is the first time where Michael wrote some of the songs himself. Like, this is his first sort of solo record. He'd done a lot of work with the Jackson 5, but this is the first time I think that Michael Jackson was solo. And I also think it's the first time where he gets songwriting credit. So he writes 3 of the tracks on here. And Quincy Jones produces all of them. The 3 that Michael Jackson wrote, Quincy co-produced them with Michael. So, and it's very hard to see, but they mentioned Quincy Jones's name down here, like a Quincy Jones production, a few different times. So, he's such a prolific, again, composer, arranger, artist. I felt that I owed it to him to do a little tribute to him here. So. If you're familiar with Quincy Jones and his work, leave a comment. Let me know which of his works that you like or you're familiar with, or maybe you are not familiar with him, or you weren't aware of the breadth of his work, and maybe you knew some of his songs but didn't realize it was him. So that's cool. Like another one would be, if you've seen Kill Bill, there's a song in there that is actually the theme song for the TV show Ironsides, and they use it sporadically. Like, they use the cues from that song throughout Kill Bill, at least volume 1, if not also 2. And that was Quincy Jones wrote that. So definitely check him out, look him up in your streaming service of choice or whatever, and let me know what you think about that. Also, I mentioned today is November 4th. That means tomorrow is November 5th, 2024. It's election day. Please get out and vote, folks. I went early. I voted today, so I've got my sticker on here on my shirt as we speak. But please make sure that you do that. Don't let other people decide for you in this very important election here in the United States. So with that, I will say cheers. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you next time.